I've lived next to her for 3 months without saying more than hello, and that suited me fine. I'm not a man who goes looking for company, and she seemed like the kind of woman who had plenty of it already. But I'd borrowed her shovel to dig out a root near my fence, and it had been sitting in my garage long enough that keeping it felt rude. So, one warm evening, I walked it back to her porch, expecting to hand it over and be home in 5 minutes. She opened the door in a summer dress, smiled at me like she'd been waiting, and said I'd picked the perfect night to knock. I stood there with the shovel in one hand and no idea what to say next. The porch light cast a warm circle around her, and behind her I could see the glow of a lamp and something on the stove that smelled like cinnamon. She didn't reach for the shovel. She stepped aside and held the door open wider, tilting her head toward the 2 wicker chairs like she'd been expecting someone to fill one of them all evening. "You should stay," she told me, and it wasn't a plea or a question, just a simple invitation delivered the way you'd mentioned the weather. I almost said no. The word was right there, ready and polite, the same word I'd used to turn down every dinner invitation for the past 4 years. But something about the evening made me set the shovel against the railing and sit down. The air still held the warmth of the day, and the fireflies were starting up in the grass between our yards. The chair creaked under me, and I realized that it had been years since I sat in a chair that wasn't mine. Stella disappeared inside and came back with a pitcher of iced tea and 2 tall glasses with little flowers etched into the sides. She poured mine full and handed it to me. Our fingers touched for a second around the cold glass, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the simple awareness of another person's skin against mine. I'm 56 years old, and I've lived in this house for most of my adult life. My wife Margaret and I bought it the year we got married, back when the neighborhood was new and the trees were short and everything felt like it was just beginning. We raised our life here slowly, with patience, and by the time the trees were tall enough to shade the whole yard, the life we'd built was the kind that doesn't make for dramatic stories. It was just good, quiet and steady, the way I thought it would always be. Then Margaret got sick, and the steadiness I'd counted on turned out to be something that could be taken away. She fought it for almost a year, and I sat beside her through every appointment and every long night and every morning where her eyes told me she knew something I didn't yet. When she passed, the house didn't just get quiet. It got a different kind of quiet, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that sits in the rooms and reminds you what used to fill them. That was 4 years ago. I learned to live around the silence, the way you learn to live around anything, by building routines and filling the hours and not thinking too hard about what was missing. I garden in the mornings, fix things around the house in the afternoons, and sit on my own porch in the evenings with a book I usually don't finish. The neighbors are kind, and they stopped asking me to dinner when I kept saying no. I told myself that was what I wanted, to be left alone with my quiet. And then Stella moved in next door, and the quiet didn't change, but something about the way I sat inside it did. She was hard not to notice, not because she tried to be noticed, but because she moved through the world with a kind of ease I'd forgotten existed. Red hair that she wore loose most days, a laugh that carried over the fence on weekend afternoons, and a way of waving at me across the yard that felt warm without being intrusive. We'd spoken maybe 4 times, all brief, all about practical things like property lines and trash pickup days. I liked that she didn't push. She seems to understand, without me saying it, that I was a man who kept to himself, and that the keeping was a choice, not a wound, or at least I'd told myself it was a choice. Sitting on her porch that evening, with the iced tea sweating in my hand, I realized I'd been wrong about that. The keeping to myself hadn't been a choice for years. It had become a habit, and habits have a way of turning into walls without you noticing, and by the time you see the wall, you've forgotten where the door used to be. But her porch light was on, and the tea was cold, and she was sitting 3 feet away from me in a wicker chair. For the first time in years, I didn't want to go home. The tea was cold and sweet, the kind with lemon in it, and I drank half the glass before I realized I was nervous. Not the kind of nervous you feel before something bad happens, but the kind that comes from sitting close to someone you don't know well. Stella settled into the other wicker chair and tucked her feet underneath her. She watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read, curious and open and unhurried all at once. She asked how long I'd lived here, and I told her, and that opened the door to other questions. She asked about the yard, about the neighborhood, about whether the soil was good for growing things. She asked if I'd always been a gardener, and I said no, that Margaret had been the one with the green thumb. I told her I had taken it up after Margaret passed, because the garden was the one part of her I could still keep alive. I said it easily, the way you talk about something that hurt a long time ago, but has settled into something you can hold. Stella didn't flinch or look away or rush to say something comforting. She just nodded, slow and steady, and told me that was a beautiful reason to garden. The way she said it, without pity or performance, made me feel like she understood something about grief that most people don't. Grief doesn't need to be fixed or smoothed over, just acknowledged. The conversation moved the way good conversations do when nobody is trying to steer it. She asked about the route I'd been digging out, and I told her about the stubborn elm that kept sending runners under my fence, no matter how many times I cut them back. She laughed, and the sound of it sat in the warm air between us, like something I wanted to keep. I asked about her garden, which was mostly potted plants and a few herbs in the kitchen window, and she talked about them the way someone talks about pets, with real affection and a little worry about whether the basil was getting enough light. Somewhere in the middle of all that talking, I stopped being nervous. I don't know exactly when it happened, but I became aware that I was leaning back in my chair with my glass resting on my knee, and the tightness I'd carried into the evening had loosened without me noticing. It was the kind of thing that doesn't happen often, the feeling of being comfortable with someone you barely know. I tried not to think about it too hard, because thinking about it would have made it go away. She asked about my work, and I told her I'd been a carpenter for 30 years, building cabinets and shelves and bookcases for people who wanted something that lasted. I still took small jobs when I felt like it, mostly for neighbors, mostly because it gave me a reason to use my hands. She asked if I missed it, and I said I missed the smell of fresh-cut wood and the feeling of a joint fitting together perfectly, but I didn't miss the early mornings or the dust in my lungs. She told me she worked from home, doing something with graphic design, making logos and letterheads for small businesses. She liked the work because it let her sit in her own kitchen in the morning with a cup of coffee and create something from nothing. She said it was the first job she'd ever had where the quiet felt like a tool instead of a punishment. I liked the way she talked about her work, with the same quiet pride I felt about a well-built shelf, the satisfaction of someone who makes things even if her hands worked a keyboard instead of a saw. The ice in our glasses had melted by the time she asked me something that shifted the conversation. I felt the evening turn a corner I hadn't expected. She looked at me with those steady eyes and asked how long I'd been married. And the question was simple and direct, the kind that strips away the small talk and asks you to be honest. I told her 28 years, and she let the number sit there for a moment without rushing past it. 28 years is a long time. Long enough that the life you build with someone becomes the structure your days hang on. When that structure goes, you have to figure out what shape your days are supposed to take without it. I'd figured it out, or I'd thought I had, but sitting there on Stella's porch, I realized the shape I'd given my days was more about getting through them than living them. I talked about Margaret the way I hadn't talked about her in years, not with anyone, because most people either wanted to comfort me or change the subject. Both of those things made the talking harder, but Stella just listened. She held her glass with both hands and watched me with those quiet, steady eyes, and the listening itself felt like something, like a room I could walk into and set things down. I told her about the first year after Margaret passed, how the house felt like it was holding its breath. I'd walk from room to room in the evening and feel the absence of her in every corner, like a draft you can't find the source of. I told her about the morning I found her reading glasses in the kitchen drawer, 6 months after the funeral. I sat on the floor and held them for an hour because they still carried the faint smell of her hand cream, that soft lavender scent she'd used for as long as I'd known her. I told her about learning to cook for one person, which is harder than it sounds because every recipe in the world assumes you're feeding someone else. I had started making extra just so the fridge wouldn't look so empty. I told her about the first time I caught myself setting 2 plates on the table out of habit, and how I stood there, looking at the second plate for a while before I put it back in the cabinet. Stella didn't say anything for a while after I finished. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind that follows something real. The kind that says, I heard you, and I'm not going to cheapen it with a response that's too small for what you just shared. Then she told me I'd loved her a lot, and it wasn't a question, and I said yes. Something about saying it out loud, to this woman I barely knew, felt like opening a window I'd painted shut. I told her about the years that followed, how the grief changed shape over time. It went from something sharp that cut through everything, to something softer, a dull ache that lived in the background, like a low hum you stop hearing after a while. I told her I'd stopped expecting the ache to go away, and that I'd made peace with it the way you make peace with weather, by learning to live in it instead of waiting for it to change. And then I said something I hadn't planned to say, something that came out before I could catch it. I told her that the hardest part wasn't the grief or the loneliness, but the feeling that the best part of my life was behind me, and that everything from here on would be quieter and smaller and less. I said it and immediately wished I hadn't, because it sounded like the kind of thing a sad old man says when he's given up. I didn't want her to see me that way. But Stella looked at me, and she told me she knew that feeling, and the way she said it made me realize she wasn't just being kind. She was telling me something about herself, something she'd been carrying too, and I felt the conversation shift from my story to ours. She was quiet for a moment, turning her glass in her hands, and I could feel the conversation moving into her territory. The fireflies had thickened in the yard, and the air had cooled just enough that I could feel the difference on my arms. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then went quiet. The evening had settled into that deep summer stillness where the world stops moving, and the only sounds are the small ones, crickets and frogs, and the distant hum of someone's air conditioner. She told me she'd moved here 6 months ago, and then she paused, like she was deciding how much to let me see. She said she'd left a relationship that wasn't bad, not in the way people mean when they say bad. He didn't yell or cheat or do anything she could point to and call the reason. He was fine, and they were fine, and fine was slowly making her disappear. She said it without bitterness, which surprised me. There was no anger in her voice, just the honest clarity of someone who'd spent a long time figuring out what she needed to say, and was finally saying it. She told me about 4 years with a man who was kind but never curious, who liked having her beside him but never asked what she was thinking. He planned their weekends without wondering if she wanted something different. She said she'd spent so long shrinking herself to fit the space he'd made for her that she'd forgotten what size she was supposed to be. So she left, and the simplicity of it struck me, not in a dramatic way, not in the middle of the night or with a speech. She told him she needed to figure out who she was when she wasn't trying to be what someone else needed, and he said he understood, and she thought he did, in his way. And she found this house, and she moved in, and she'd been sitting on this porch most evenings since. She looked out at the yard, and I watched her face in the porch light, the way her expression held something I recognized. It was that particular loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being unknown. I'd felt it for 4 years, and seeing it in someone 30 years younger than me made me realize it doesn't care about age, that ache of wanting to be seen by someone who isn't looking through you. The first few months were harder than she expected, she told me. She thought being alone would feel like freedom, and sometimes it did, but mostly it felt like a big, empty house with no one to tell about your day. She'd cook dinner and sit at the table and realize she had no one to say, "You should try this," to. She smiled when she said it, and it was a sad smile but a real one, and she told me she'd started talking to her plants. She said she wasn't proud of it, but it helped. I laughed at that, and she laughed too, and the sound of both of us laughing together felt like something I'd forgotten could happen. The laughter settled between us and stayed there, warm and easy. I thought about how long it had been since I'd laughed with another person, not a polite chuckle at a neighbor's joke, but a real laugh, the kind that comes from recognizing yourself in someone else's story. And I understood then what she meant about the perfect night, not because she explained it, but because I felt it. She hadn't been waiting for me specifically. She'd been waiting for someone to knock, anyone who would sit and talk and fill the evening with something real instead of the echo of her own thoughts. And I'd been waiting too, only I hadn't known it, because I'd told myself the waiting was over and the quiet was enough, and the life I had was the life I'd chosen. But it wasn't enough. I knew that now, sitting on her porch with the fireflies and the iced tea, and her voice still hanging in the air between us. It hadn't been enough for years, and the only thing that had kept me from knowing it was the wall I'd built out of routine and politeness, and the careful avoidance of anything that might make me feel something again. After that, the conversation slowed down, not because we'd run out of things to say, but because we'd said enough for the moment. The evening had deepened around us, and the street was dark now except for the scattered porch lights of the other houses, each one a small, warm island in the dark. I sat back in my chair and let the quiet settle. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like mine alone. It felt shared, like a blanket stretched between two people who'd agreed to sit under it together. Stella went inside at some point, and I heard her moving around in the kitchen, the soft clink of glasses and a drawer opening and closing. She came back with a light cotton blanket, the kind you keep on the back of a couch for cool evenings, and she draped it over my shoulders without asking. The gesture was so natural and so tender that I felt something catch in my chest, a small knot I didn't know was there. She told me I looked cold, and she sat back down, closer to me than before, not touching, but near enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence beside me. I pulled the blanket around my shoulders and let myself notice things I'd been too careful to notice earlier. The way she tucked her feet under her in the chair. The way she looked up at the sky instead of at me when she was thinking. The way her red hair caught the porch light and held it like something warm trapped in copper. We sat like that for a while, not speaking, just being there. A car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping across the yards and then gone, and somewhere a cricket started up, that steady, patient sound that fills the summer dark. It had been years since I'd sat with someone and didn't feel the need to fill the air with words. Most silence in company feels like a gap you should patch, but this silence felt like something whole on its own, something that didn't need fixing or filling. Stella told me she liked this part of the evening, and I told her I'd forgotten this part existed. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant, and I think she did, because she'd been sitting in this same quiet, on this same porch for months, waiting for someone to share it with. The night had a quality to it that I can only describe as unhurried, the kind of time that doesn't feel like it's passing because you're not counting it. I wasn't thinking about what time it was, or how long I'd been there, or what I needed to do when I got home. I was just there, on her porch, under her blanket, beside someone who felt like a friend I hadn't met yet. And somewhere in that quiet, without even realizing it, I stopped thinking of myself as a man who was fine on his own. I started thinking of myself as a man who'd been fine for too long. And then a thought crossed my mind that pulled me out of the warmth, and I couldn't push it away no matter how hard I tried. The thought was simple, and it sat in my chest like a stone. I'm 56 years old, and she's maybe 28, and I'm sitting on her porch at 10 o'clock at night, under her blanket. The distance between those two numbers is a distance I had no business crossing. It wasn't that she'd done anything wrong. She'd been kind and warm and honest, and the evening had been the best I'd had in longer than I could remember. But kindness and warmth can exist without meaning what you want them to mean, and I'd lived long enough to know that a younger woman's friendliness isn't an invitation, no matter how much the lonely part of you wants it to be. I started to feel the weight of the evening, the awareness that I'd stayed too long, talked too much, let myself feel things I should have kept behind the fence I'd built around my quiet life. I sat up straighter and set my glass on the small table between us. I told her I should probably let her get to bed, and I tried to make it sound casual, the way you say goodnight to a neighbor after a brief visit. I started to stand, and my hand found the railing for balance, and the shovel was right there, leaning against the post where I'd left it 2 hours ago. Stella didn't move to stop me, and I was grateful for that because it confirmed what I'd been thinking, that this was neighborly kindness and nothing more, and I'd been fooling myself to imagine otherwise. I lifted the shovel and took the first step down, and the evening air hit my face, cooler now than when I'd arrived. I thought that was that, a nice evening with a nice woman, and tomorrow I'd go back to my routine and my quiet and my book I wouldn't finish. But then she said something that stopped me with one hand on the railing and one foot already on the porch step. She asked if I was leaving because I wanted to, or because I thought I should. The question landed in the quiet between us, and I stood there, half up, half seated, and I couldn't answer it right away because the honest answer was both. I wanted to stay more than I'd wanted anything in years, and I thought I should leave because wanting something this much at my age from someone this young felt like a kind of greed I didn't want to be guilty of. I sat back down. I told her both, that I wanted to stay and that I thought I should go, and that the two things had been fighting each other since the moment she handed me that glass of tea. She listened, and her face was calm and open and carried no judgment, and then she told me she'd like me to stay. The directness of it disarmed me completely, because there was no hidden meaning to decode, no polite way to interpret it as anything other than what it was. She wanted me to stay, and she said so. And I stayed. I stayed, and the act of staying felt like the first real choice I'd made in 4 years, maybe longer. Every decision since Margaret passed had been about maintenance, about keeping things running, about getting through the day and the week and the season. This was different. This was choosing something I wanted, not because I needed it to survive, but because it was good, and the goodness of it scared me more than the loneliness ever had. Loneliness is familiar, and goodness isn't, and familiar things are easy to hold even when they're hurting you. The conversation changed after that, not in topic, but in temperature, the way a room changes when someone opens a window and lets the night air in. We were both being more honest than we'd been all evening, and the honesty had a weight to it that made the small talk we'd started with feel like something from a different day. I could feel the shift in my own chest, the sense that something was being decided without either of us naming it, something that would matter past tonight. I told her I hadn't expected this. I told her I'd stopped thinking of my life as something that could surprise me, that the years since Margaret had taught me that the shape of your days gets set and stays set. I'd made peace with that the way you make peace with getting older, by not fighting it. And then I knocked on her door with a shovel, and the shape of my evening changed, and I didn't know what to do with that because it had been so long since anything changed. Stella listened, and then she told me something I carried home with me and have carried every day since. She told me she hadn't moved here looking for anyone. She'd moved here to learn how to be alone without disappearing. But she was glad I knocked, and she was glad I stayed, and she didn't think that took anything away from what she'd come here to find. She said it looking right at me, and her eyes were steady and clear, and I believed her completely. The way you believe someone who isn't trying to convince you of anything, but is simply telling you what's true for them. She reaches over and puts her hand on mine. just rests it there on the arm of my chair, her palm warm against the back of my hand, her fingers still and light. The touch is simple, and it isn't asking for anything, and I feel the weight of it move through me like something I'd been dehydrated for without knowing. It's been 4 years since anyone touched me with tenderness. 4 years since a hand reached for mine and meant something by it. And the feeling is so large and so familiar and so strange that I can't hold it all at once. I let myself feel it. I don't pull away or make a joke or redirect the conversation. Because the truth is, I need this. The simple fact of another person's hand on mine. The warmth of someone choosing to be close. I think about all the times in the last 4 years when someone patted my shoulder or shook my hand at the hardware store. Those touches felt like signals, brief and transactional, the contact of people passing through each other's lives. This is different. This touch stays. It doesn't move, and it doesn't ask, and it doesn't explain itself, and I realize that's what tenderness is. Not a gesture, but a willingness to stay beside someone without needing a reason. We sit like that, her hand on mine, the porch light humming above us, the night deep and still around the 2 chairs and the blanket and the cold glasses and the shovel leaning against the railing. Neither of us says anything for a long time, and we don't need to, because the silence between us has become the thing that's doing the talking, and it's saying everything that words would have gotten wrong. I think about what this is, and I think about what it isn't, and I decide that I don't need to know. It's enough to be here, enough to feel her hand on mine, enough to sit in the warm dark and let the evening be what it is, without naming it or claiming it or worrying about what it'll become. And somewhere in that silence, I understand what she meant about the perfect night. It wasn't about the weather or the fireflies or the time of year. It was about this, the moment when 2 people who'd been alone in their own ways stopped being alone for a few hours and let the evening hold them both. And the holding was enough, and the enough was everything. The night had gotten late in the way that only good evenings do, where you stop checking the time and then suddenly realize how dark it's gotten. The fireflies were gone, settled into the grass for the night, and the street was completely still, the kind of still that only happens after midnight in a neighborhood where everyone goes to bed early. I could feel the tiredness in my legs and the coolness in the air. I knew the evening was coming to its natural end, the way all good things do, not because they fail, but because they complete. I told her I should go, and this time I meant it, not as an escape, but as the honest recognition that the evening had been exactly the right length. Stella nodded, and we both stood, and the blanket slid off my shoulders, and I folded it and set it on the chair. She walked me to the porch steps, and I picked up the shovel. We stood there for a moment in the circle of the porch light, having said more to each other in one evening than most neighbors say in a year. She told me she'd see me tomorrow, and it wasn't a vague pleasantry. It was a plan, the kind that has a specific shape to it even though she didn't name the time. I said yes, and then I said goodnight, and there was a moment at the bottom of the steps where neither of us moved. I held the shovel across my chest like a man who'd forgotten he was carrying it, and she stood at the top of the steps with her arms folded loosely, and we looked at each other in the porch light. Not a kiss, not a hug, not anything that could be named and filed away. Just a look, the kind that says, I see you, and I'm glad you're here, and I hope you come back, all at once, without a single word. I turned and walked down the path, and I didn't look back until I reached my own yard. When I did, the porch light was still on, and she was still standing in the doorway, and she lifted her hand in a small wave. I lifted mine, and then I crossed my yard thinking about how many evenings I'd spent on my own porch across the way, watching her lights come on and go off, never once thinking about walking over. I thought about the shovel, and how small a thing it was, how ordinary, and how it had given me a reason to knock on a door I'd been walking past for 3 months. Without that shovel, I'd still be sitting on my own porch right now, reading a book I wouldn't finish, and she'd be sitting on hers, talking to her plants. The shovel felt different in my hands now, lighter somehow, like the evening had taken something off it that I hadn't known was there. I carried it across the dark grass and thought about how the smallest things in life are the ones that change everything. The borrowed tools and the short walks and the simple knocks on a door, and we never see them coming because they don't look like change when they start. They just look like Tuesday. I went through the garage and hung the shovel back on its hook, and I stood there for a minute in the dark, smelling the motor oil and the old wood, feeling the evening still sitting in my chest like something warm I'd swallowed. Then I pushed through the door into my kitchen, and the house was the same as it always was. The same counter, the same table, the same chair pushed in where I always left it, the same quiet that had been my companion for 4 years. But the quiet felt different tonight. It didn't feel like a wall around me, solid and familiar and safe. It felt like a room with a door I'd forgotten was there, and the door was standing open, and the night air was coming through it, and I couldn't bring myself to close it. I stood in the kitchen and breathed in the smell of the house, the old wood and the lemon cleaner I used on the counters. The smell felt different too, less like something that belonged only to me, and more like a place someone else could walk into. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten alone every evening since Margaret passed, and I didn't turn on the television or open a book or do any of the things I usually did to fill the silence. I just sat there, and I let the evening stay with me. The sound of Stella's laugh, the weight of her hand on mine, the way she'd looked at me in the porch light at the bottom of the steps. I thought about her question, the one that had stopped me with one foot on the porch step, and how she'd asked it without any agenda, just honest curiosity about whether I was leaving because I wanted to, or because I thought I should. I didn't have an answer that night, and I still don't, not entirely. But I know that I stayed, and that staying felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years, and that the honesty of it scared me and comforted me at the same time. I sat there long enough that the kitchen window went from dark to the faintest gray, and I thought about what comes next. I thought about the fact that tomorrow is a word I'd stopped using with any real expectation, that my tomorrows had all looked the same for so long that I'd stopped seeing them as separate things. But tomorrow looked different now. Tomorrow had a porch, and a woman with red hair, and a glass of iced tea, and a conversation that wasn't finished yet. I thought about Margaret, not with grief this time, but with something closer to gratitude. And I thought about how she would have liked Stella. She would have liked the directness, the lack of pretense, the way she asked real questions and waited for real answers. And I thought about how Margaret would have told me to stop being a fool and go back over there, and how she would have been right, and how the people who love us don't stop wanting us to be happy just because they're gone. That's not how love works. Love doesn't end when the person does. It just changes shape, the way grief does. And maybe the shape it takes is the one that pushes you toward the next thing you're supposed to find. I don't know what this is, what Stella and I have started, or where it goes, or what shape it takes. I don't know if it's the beginning of something, or just one good evening that I'll carry in my chest until it fades. But I know that when I sat at my kitchen table that night, for the first time in 4 years, the quiet didn't feel like the only option I had left. It felt like one of the options, and somewhere across the yard, a porch light was still on. I think that's all any of us really need. Not a guarantee, not a plan, not a story with a neat ending. Just the sign that someone left the light on for us, and the courage to walk toward it. I went to bed that night with the window open, and the air coming through it smelled like cut grass in summer. And somewhere in the dark, I could hear the cricket still singing its patient, steady song. I closed my eyes, and the last thing I thought about was her hand on mine, and the warmth of it, and how long it had been since something that small had felt that large. I went over to return a shovel and came home with the feeling that the best part of my life might not be behind me after all. The shovel is back on its hook, but the door it opened that night is still standing wide. If this story warmed your heart, leave a comment below and let me know which moment got you the most.